Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Roach Jeffrey, and subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. Now, the Week 16 AP Top 25 poll is out in college basketball, and I'm going to go over the rankings this week and see what I think about the changes. Houston's the number one team in college basketball for the third time this season, and they move up because Alabama lost this past week, and Houston had a 2-0 week winning at SMU, and they won against Memphis. And as long as Houston keeps winning the rest of their games in the American Conference and no other team gets huge wins down the stretch of the season, Houston should stay the number one team for the rest of the regular season at least. Alabama's at number two, and they lost at Tennessee and they won against Georgia this past week. And Alabama, that was a tough loss at Tennessee. The Volunteers played really hard in that game, and the Crimson Tide are still having a fantastic season under Nate Oates, and they were able to get a really good bounce back win over Georgia. But Houston only has two losses, and now Alabama has four, and that's why the Cougars are now the number one team again. But Alabama still has a really strong resume, and that's why they're at number two. Kansas is at number three, and they won at Oklahoma State, and they won against Baylor this past week. Bill Self, he's got the Jayhawks rolling at the right time, and they've been moving up these rankings after having a rough stretch where they lost three games in a row earlier on in the season. But now Kansas is peaking at the right time, and they're now at number three in the rankings with a chance to move up even further if they keep winning. And UCLA's at number four in the rankings, and they won against Stanford, and they won against California this past week. And UCLA's been the most consistent team in the Pac-12 this season. They've been winning a lot in the Pac-12 conference, and unlike Arizona, who has been slipping up against the teams that are below them in conference play, UCLA has done a much better job of not slipping up in the Pac-12 overall, except for a couple of occasions. And Mick Cronin has the Bruins playing great basketball, and they definitely deserve a top five ranking. Purdue falls to number five, and they lost at Maryland, and they won against Ohio State this past week. Purdue's still having a great season, and Matt Painter has the Boilermakers playing overall great basketball, but they have been slipping up lately. Since that loss at Indiana, they lost at Northwestern, now they've lost at Maryland as well. They've been struggling on the road in the past few Big Ten games. That's probably more due to the fact that the Big Ten is such a grind. But Purdue's still deserving of a top five ranking right now with their great resume, but they're going to have to start winning some games to finish out the Big Ten regular season if they want to stay in the top five. Virginia's at number six, and they won at Louisville, and they won against Notre Dame this past week. And Virginia moves up one spot, but they really struggled this past week, barely beating two teams that are below 500 in the ACC by a combined 5 points. They're going to have to play better basketball if they want to keep winning and be able to have a great season come March Madness. But the Cavaliers, for now, they move up to the number six spot, but they were a little shaky this past week, barely beating the two teams that they played. Arizona's at number seven, and they won against Utah, and they won against Colorado this past week. And overall, the Wildcats have been playing much better basketball as of late. Even though they have been more inconsistent than UCLA in Pac-12 play, they're starting to get it together. And Tommy Lloyd has Arizona playing like the top 10 team that a lot of people thought that they were coming into the season. And if they can keep playing consistent basketball and not have any more slip-ups in the Pac-12, then they should stay a top 10 team, and they'll have a really good chance to do some special things come March Madness. Texas is at number eight, and they lost at Texas Tech, and they won against Oklahoma this past week. This was not the Longhorns' greatest week. Losing at Texas Tech was tough, even though the Red Raiders have been playing better basketball, and they barely beat Oklahoma at home in overtime by 2 points. So those definitely were not their best performances this season, but the Longhorns still have a top 10 resume right now. They're going to have to start playing better basketball like they were a couple weeks ago if the Longhorns want to stay a top 10 team. Baylor's the number nine, and they won against West Virginia, and they lost at Kansas this past week. Baylor's been on the rise lately. They had won 10 of their last 11 games when they were able to beat West Virginia at home, but then Baylor lost at Kansas, and that was a really tough loss for Scott Drew's team because they were winning by 13 at half. Then they ended up losing by a wide margin in the second half of that game, and the Baylor Bears still have a fantastic resume, and that's why they don't move down despite the loss. But that was a really tough loss to stop the Baylor Bears' momentum, but if they can get back on track, then they'll stay a top 10 team. Marquette's at number 10, and they won against Xavier, and they won at Georgetown this past week. Shaka Smart, he has the Golden Eagles looking like the team to be in the Big East. They've been up and down a bit this season, but they're starting to peak at the right time. They're playing much better basketball, and they were able to get a 1-point win over Xavier last week, and that was a huge win to be able to get a little separation in the Big East standings. And then winning at Georgetown, the Hoyas are really struggling this season. They were really dominant in that game. But Marquette moves up into the top 10. They have a great resume overall, and they're looking like a really great team this year. Tennessee's at number 11, and they won against Alabama, and they lost at Kentucky this past week. This past week epitomizes exactly the way the Tennessee Volunteers have been playing basketball this season. They got the win over the former number one team in Alabama at home, and they played really well in that game. But then they lost at Kentucky, and they had a horrible game on the road against the Kentucky Wildcats. And overall, Tennessee's been very inconsistent, and that epitomizes what Rick Barnes' team has been over his tenure as the head coach, because they play really good against teams that are better than them, but then they slip up against teams that are worse than them. So if Tennessee wants to have a really good March Madness, they cannot have a slip up early on in the first round of the NCAA tournament or overlook any team that they play, because Tennessee needs to give the same effort that they give against top teams. And if they do, then they're capable of beating anybody in the country. Gonzaga's at number 12, and they won at Loyola Marymount, and they won at Pepperdine this past week. This was a great week for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Mark Few's team got revenge on Loyola Marymount, who beat the Gonzaga Bulldogs at home, and that was Gonzaga's first home loss in a long time. And they won at Loyola Marymount this time by 40. That was a really good revenge game for them. And then they beat Pepperdine pretty comfortably. So this is a really good week for Gonzaga. And if they're able to win the rematch against the St. Mary's Gales later on in the season, then Gonzaga still has a really good shot to potentially win the West Coast Conference and have a really good seed come the NCAA tournament. Miami's at number 13, and they won at UNC, and they won against Wake Forest this past week. And Miami's looking better and better as the season's going along. A lot of people had concerns with the Hurricanes because they were kind of an inconsistent team like Arizona, but also like Arizona, they've been playing much better as of late. And they're looking right now like they could potentially be the second best team in the ACC. But if Virginia keeps struggling, who knows? Maybe Miami could potentially be the best team in the ACC this season. But they're going to have to stay consistent and play really good basketball. And if Jim Larinaga's team can continue to do that, then Miami will stay in the top 15 of the rankings and potentially have a great March Madness as well. Kansas State's number 14, and they lost at Oklahoma, and they won against Iowa State this past week. And the Kansas State Wildcats have had a great season with Jerome Tang in his first season as head coach, but they've had some slip-ups lately in the Big 12 Conference. But the Big 12, like the Big 10, is a grind, one of the toughest conferences in college basketball. The Big 12, every single team is capable of beating you on a given night, and that's what Oklahoma did to Kansas State, but at least they were able to get a bounce-back win over Iowa State to not drop too far in the top 25 rankings. They're still having a great season. St. Mary's is number 15. They won at San Diego, and they won against BYU this past week. The Gales move up 2 spots for their solid week, but they were a bit shaky at San Diego, only winning by 3, and they were able to beat BYU by 6 at home. But this wasn't the most dominating week for the Gales, but they did get 2 wins, and that's all that matters. And the Gales move back in the top 15 because of it. Xavier's at number 16, and they lost at Marquette, and they won against DePaul this past week. Xavier's been a team that without Zach Freeman, they have been struggling a little bit, and they haven't been playing as good of basketball as they were earlier in the season. But a loss by 1 at Marquette is not a terrible loss, and they're still playing really solid basketball, and they did beat DePaul by a pretty good amount. So overall, Xavier still has a great resume that's worthy of a top 25 ranking, and Sean Miller has the Musketeers as one of the best teams in the Big East this season. Indiana's at number 17, and they lost at Northwestern, and they won against Illinois this past week. The Hoosiers dropped 3 spots this week, and Mike Woodson's team overall is still playing much better basketball right now than they were earlier in the season. They're starting to get healthy, and all they need is the return of Xavier Johnson to get their whole entire team back to be at their healthiest at the right time for March Madness. But that was a really tough loss for Indiana at Northwestern. They were able to get a bounce back win at Illinois at home. So overall, Indiana's having a really good season, and they had a pretty solid week, but they still dropped 3 spots for the loss at Northwestern. UConn's at number 18, and they won against Seton Hall this past week. UConn was a team that was fading earlier on in the season, and they were really struggling in Big East play after having a fantastic start of the season in the non-conference. But UConn has been getting it together, and Dan Hurley's righted the ship and gotten UConn to play better basketball as of late, and they're now starting to look like one of the better teams in the Big East again, and potentially a team that could do some special things come March Madness. Creighton's at number 19, and they lost at Providence, and they won at St. John's this past week. Creighton's been on a tear lately, and they've been playing some of the best basketball of anybody in the country lately now that they're healthy and Ryan Kalkbrenner's back and playing at a high level. But Creighton did lose at Providence. That was a really tough loss, but they did bounce back and get a good win at St. John's. And overall, the Blue Jays still like one of the top teams in the Big East, and they look like they could be a really dangerous team in the NCAA tournament. Providence is number 20, and they won against Creighton. They won against Villanova this past week. This was a great week for Ed Cooley's team. Providence was a team that was kind of struggling as the Big East slate had been going along. Overall, they were a team that was kind of alternating wins at home and then losing games on the road. But now they were able to get 2 big wins, even though both of them were at home this past week, to stay in the top 25 rankings and toward the top of the Big East standings. Northwestern enters the top 25 at number 21, and they won against Indiana and they won against Iowa this past week. This is the first time that the Wildcats are ranked in the top 25 since 2020, and it looks like Northwestern's a lock for the NCAA tournament. Just their second trip to the NCAA tournament in program history, and Chris Collins has done a fantastic job this season. After losing Pete Nance to North Carolina and Ryan Young to Duke, he's kept the team together, and Boo Buie and Chase Aldridge are playing great basketball this season. And this was probably their most important week of the season, getting two really important wins at home. And they have a really great resume overall, and they're definitely deserving of a top 25 ranking, and they should be a lock for the NCAA tournament. San Diego State's at number 22, and they won at Fresno State this past week. The Aztecs are looking like the team to beat in the Mountain West right now. Other teams in the Mountain West have been slipping as of late, but San Diego State has been really consistent, and they do drop one spot because you're in a mid-major conference, and a lot of other teams won that moved ahead of them. But San Diego State did what they had to do this past week, winning at Fresno State, and that was a really good win for Brian Dutcher's team. Iowa State's at number 23, and they won against TCU, and they lost at Kansas State this past week. Iowa State now has 9 losses, and they have been fading down the stretch of the Big 12 season, but they're still playing solid basketball, and they do have enough quality wins at home, especially to stay in the top 25 rankings because the Big 12 is so tough. They still have a better resume than most teams in college basketball, but the losses are starting to mount, and if they keep losing, they'll fall out of the top 25, but they're still barely hanging on for now. TCU's at number 24, and they lost at Iowa State, and they won against Oklahoma State this past week. TCU, like Iowa State, has been slipping down the Big 12 standings as conference play has gone along, but TCU has an excuse, though, because Mike Miles and Eddie Lampkin missed some time for the Horned Frogs, but now that Mike Miles has returned, he played in the Oklahoma State game, and they got a huge win over the Cowboys. The Horned Frogs could be playing better basketball as the season goes along, and if they do, they'll stay in the top 25, but all those games that they play without him are definitely a big reason why they were moving down the standings, because they were losing. But now TCU has a really good chance to turn things around that Mike Miles has returned. Texas A&M's at number 25, and they enter the top 25 just like Northwestern, and they won against Arkansas, and they won at Missouri this past week. This was a huge week for the Aggies, and Buzz Williams has done a fantastic job getting Texas A&M to play really good basketball in SEC play. Even though the SEC overall might not be as strong this year, Texas A&M has taken advantage of it, and they have a great conference record, and this was a big week for their tournament resume, getting 2 really solid wins over Arkansas and at Missouri. And if Texas A&M can keep winning, they'll stay in the top 25, and they'll make the NCAA tournament. And NC State and Florida Atlantic dropped out of the top 25 rankings for losing games this past week. And the teams that are in the other team votes, you have NC State, Pittsburgh, Oral Roberts, Maryland, Kentucky, Boise State, Florida Atlantic, Arkansas, Charleston, Southern Miss, Duke, Missouri, Kent State, Illinois, Nevada, and Oklahoma State. All teams that are just outside the top 25 rankings. A lot of these teams have been ranked at some point this season, and they can move back into the top 25 if they start getting some big wins down the stretch of the regular season. So that's the Week 16 AP Top 25 rankings. There's been a lot more movement. We're getting really close to March Madness, and it's crunch time for a lot of these teams that still need to get some wins to be able to be a lock for the NCAA tournament. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens down the stretch of the regular season and where all these teams end up in the final AP Top 25 rankings. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below what you think about the Week 16 AP Top 25 rankings and whether you think the AP voters ranked the teams about right this week, and I will see you next time.